A former CDC director has gone against Dr. Anthony Fauci's claims surrounding the origins of COVID-19. While we have no definitive answers on how coronavirus came to be, there are certainly theories being explored. The main two being the virus either originated from a lab leak in China, either as a mistake or with the intention of being used as a bioweapon, or the virus originated naturally, say from a bat passing it on to humans. Dr. Fauci has said that he's keeping an open mind that coronavirus could have originated from a lab leak in China, but he believes it looks very much like this was a natural occurrence. Former CDC Director Robert R. Redfield does not fully support Dr. Fauci's hypothesis, claiming he still believes the virus originated from the Wuhan Institute of Technology in China. He told the story that when you compare COVID to past viruses that became an epidemic, none of them became as contagious in a human-to-human way than COVID-19 did. So it's really exceptional that this virus is one of the most infectious viruses for man, and I still argue that's because it was educated how to infect human tissue. He also pointed out that it was speculated years ago that the same lab was training bat-borne viruses to jump to humans. I'm disappointed in the NIH for not leading an objective evaluation from the beginning. I think it really is antithetical to the science, where they took a very strong position that people like myself, who were somehow conspiratorial just because we have a different scientific hypothesis. He continued, I've been very disappointed in the scientific community led by NIH that has really dug their heels in from the beginning to try and minimise any of us that have a different hypothesis. Anthony Fauci is the director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is just one part of the National Institute of Health, but he is also the chief medical advisor to the president. He has come under fire in the last few years for his handling of the pandemic. But the main criticism he has received is the fact that in July last year, documents showed the National Institute of Health directed a grant of $3.1 million towards the US health organisation EcoHealth Alliance. Nearly $600,000 went straight towards the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study bat coronaviruses. Dr. Fauci has admitted under oath that the NIH did send that money for the study, but it did not fund dangerous research that could have resulted in producing coronavirus.
A major study in the origins of COVID-19 published this week. In fact, it's actually a researcher who led that project from the University of Arizona, Heidi.
Yeah, that researcher says the virus started at a live animal market, not a virus lab. 9 on Your Side's Craig Smith explains how they drew that conclusion. Craig?
There has been deep suspicion that COVID was a lab leak released from a Chinese virus research library in Wuhan, the Chinese city where COVID was first observed. The University of Arizona researcher was part of a team that feels it has solid proof humans caught the virus from a different source. University of Arizona scientist Michael Warby is a specialist in how viruses develop and evolve. He says at one time he thought it was at least worth checking whether COVID was a lab leak from a Chinese laboratory in Wuhan, China. But his research led him to conclude it is far more likely the virus moved from animals to humans in what's called a wet market, where shoppers buy live exotic animals to kill and eat. He says in the huge city of Wuhan, there was a strong pattern of COVID cases spreading from just one spot.
The epidemiological preponderance of cases linked to the Wuhan market is not a mirage. It's a real thing. It was there before anyone knew about the market in the earliest hospitalized cases.
3 other researchers joined Warby in this conclusion during a news conference hosted by the prestigious American Association for the Advancement of Science. The researchers understand skeptics have embraced the lab leak theory, and they may be more skeptical because the researchers used data gathered by Chinese scientists.
The data that came from China looks like the data that came from everywhere else in the world, and there's no inconsistency there. So I have no reason to doubt the veracity of the genomic data produced by Chinese scientists.
The researchers say Chinese scientists they work with share their dedication to truthful research, even if the Chinese government is not happy with either theory of how the virus got started.
To that new intelligence report from the U.S. Energy Department. It suggests COVID-19 likely originated from a laboratory leak in Wuhan, China. NBC's Kelly Kobiea is on that story this morning. What can you tell us, Kelly, about these findings?
How was your weekend? Well, Savannah, we're now nearly 3 years on from the start of the pandemic, and there are still more questions than answers when it comes to the origins of COVID-19. But this new report suggests that it actually did come from a lab in Wuhan, China, that so-called lab leak theory. That's what two sources with direct knowledge of the report told NBC News. The sources said that according to this classified report, the Department of Energy has now concluded with low confidence where coronavirus originated. One source cautioning that this is not being viewed as hugely significant because of disagreements among different intelligence agencies. The source told NBC News that key lawmakers on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees were actually briefed on this report more than a month ago. China is also weighing in overnight, saying that officials should stop, quote, hyping up the lab leak theory and politicizing the origin tracing process. Savannah.
Well, speaking of politics, there are other investigations into this very issue.
Yeah, that's right. And Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, was asked about the investigating process over the weekend on CNN Sunday. He said that, look, there are a variety of views within the intelligence agencies. He said that a number of the agencies have said they just don't have enough information to be sure on the origins of COVID-19. He said the president has repeatedly directed every intelligence agency to put effort and resources to get to the bottom of this, and specifically requested that the national labs, which are part of the Department of Energy, work on finding answers. Now, the DOE spokesperson did comment on this to NBC News, saying the Department of Energy continues to support the thorough, careful, and objective work of our intelligence professionals in investigating the origins of COVID-19 as the president directed. A spokesperson for the House Oversight Committee is also commenting on this, saying in part, we're reviewing the classified information provided, but Republican lawmakers are also on top of this. They're pushing for more investigations. They want extensive hearings as well, and they want the Biden administration to release more information to the American people.
Michelle, I suppose the question I ask myself is, I've heard this before. It's been thrown around as a theory at the start, right the way through. So what is new in the Journal story?
So the Journal has reported that the Energy Department has received additional information that points to the lab leak theory. What specifically it is was not disclosed, but we do know that there is something that 3 years into the pandemic, there was a new piece of information that changed the perspective of the Energy Department in terms of what they believe caused COVID-19 to emerge. We do know that other government agencies are not on board in the U.S., that there are competing theories even among U.S. intelligence agencies. Whether they're going to get to some kind of conclusion about that is still to be determined, but the fact that there is new information coming 3 years in is pretty significant at this point.
So how does this affect the course ahead in terms of, the belief of U.S. intelligence agencies and, understanding the source of an event like this?
So the U.S. and the World Health Organization and others are still really trying to dig into this. They are trying to get additional information to find out what could have happened. But of course, we are 3 years into the pandemic at this point, and a lot of the information that we would have needed, a lot of the samples and the studies that needed to be done should have gotten going, years ago at this point. So they are still working. They're reaching out to China. China has gotten a lot of pushback from the World Health Organization and others for not being more collaborative. And we'll see. They are actually getting some criticism, some skepticism around some of these, the fact that they're not working with international bodies. And the argument is that if they didn't have anything to hide, they would be more collaborative. So people who were originally writing off many of these allegations as conspiracy theories are now starting to rethink it a little bit. So we'll have to see what goes on here in the days and weeks to come.
Calling out China, the U.S. ambassador to China tonight demanding the country, quote, be more honest about the origin of COVID-19. This after a new report from the U.S. Department of Energy found the virus likely resulted from a lab leak in Wuhan, where the first cases of the virus appeared. The Chinese government tonight, as usual, is denying the lab leak theory. Our David Culver has a South Front investigation on what he witnessed when he traveled to what is still ground zero for COVID-19.
Wuhan, China. You know it as the city from which COVID-19 first emerged. But how exactly it started depends on who you ask and who you believe.
We're going to have to push China to be more honest about what happened 3 years ago in Wuhan with the origin of the COVID-19 crisis.
The U.S. Energy Department, just the latest agency to assess with low confidence that the virus likely came from a lab leak. That according to two sources. It's a claim that infuriates Chinese officials. China's foreign ministry Monday calling on the U.S. to stop smearing China and stop politicizing the issue of the virus origin. Our first of 3 trips to Wuhan investigating the virus's outbreak was in January 2020, when COVID-19 was still a mystery illness. Officially, China had only listed about 200 cases of COVID-19 at that point, including 3 deaths. But our reporting revealed the real number of infected was far greater, and the crowded Lunar New Year travel rush was underway, allowing COVID to spread rapidly. Security outside the original epicenter, the Huanan seafood market, told us to leave. Chinese officials linked some of the first cases to this market, suggesting it might have started naturally, jumping from animals to humans. But as the virus went global, the U.S. and other democracies further questioned its origins.
China is a very sophisticated country, and they could have contained it.
The claim of a lab leak put the focus and scrutiny on the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a 30-minute drive from the market. But there is another, lower-level biosafety lab in Wuhan, the Wuhan Center for Disease Control. Research was also conducted here, including that of bats and coronaviruses.
I do believe because it was at a level 2 facility, not level 4. Level 2 is very low-grade security, that it did leak out as they were trying to create this monster in the virus with an eye towards creating a vaccine.
We drove by the Wuhan Center for Disease Control in 2021, located just a couple of blocks from the Huanan seafood market, in fact. The Chinese government has repeatedly denied the claims that the virus leaked from a lab, and its state media unleashed a relentless propaganda campaign. Using digital articles, TV reports, documentaries, even a rap song. The aim? To sow doubt and deflect blame. They've also pushed conspiracy theories, including a lab leak. Not a lab in Wuhan, but this one, Fort Detrick in the United States, the home of a U.S. Army biological laboratory. Though there is no evidence the virus leaked from here, that has not stopped Chinese officials from pushing their version of a lab leak theory. Monday's response from the Foreign Ministry also cited the World Health Organization, which throughout the outbreak regularly echoed the Chinese government's narrative, taking them at their word. In January 2021, the WHO sent a team of international experts into Wuhan to research the origins. But that was already more than a year after the initial outbreak. The team initially considered the lab leak theory to be highly unlikely. But when the WHO requested a second field visit for more research, China said no.
A blunt new assessment from the head of the FBI about the origins of COVID-19, deepening the debate this morning over what triggered the global pandemic.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident.
The FBI's agents, analysts, and biological threat experts assessing that a lab in Wuhan, China was the virus's likely source. The Chinese government denies that. But FBI Director Chris Wray says they've tried to hide evidence from the world.
The observation that the Chinese government seems to me has been doing its best to try to thwart and obfuscate the work here, the work that we're doing.
Wray's comments coming just days after news broke that the U.S. Department of Energy also concluded with low confidence that the virus, which has killed more than 1.1 million Americans, had likely originated from a laboratory leak and described it as an accident. Other U.S. agencies believe the virus emerged naturally, a view which had been the mainstream scientific consensus for much of the pandemic.
The evidence strongly points to this being a natural occurrence of a jumping of a virus from a bat to an animal species to human.
The renewed debate over the pandemic's origin among the topics explored in the first primetime hearing of a new bipartisan select committee in Congress, focusing on competition between China and the United States.
And do you believe that China has taken the appropriate steps to make a future lab leak less likely?
I think that the system that's in place in China does not permit for or prize serious safety.
Let's bring in NBC News analyst John Brennan, who served as CIA director under President Obama. Director Brennan, good morning to you, sir. Let's start with the FBI director's comments there, that he has believed since 2021 with a medium level of confidence that the virus did in fact start in that Wuhan lab. Coming on the heels of that Department of Energy report that said pretty much the same thing, but with a low level of confidence. Director, based on what you've read, what you've heard from the intelligence community, where do you think this virus started?
There is a very plausible explanation, as Department of Energy and FBI believes, that it did originate from a leak from the Wuhan lab.
Do you think, again, to Garrett's point in his story there are still a number of folks who believe that it occurred naturally, perhaps started in a bat, then somehow transferred to a human. Now you've got these conflicting reports from various government agencies. Do you think we'll ever know for certain how the virus started?
Well, I think the Chinese are making it very difficult for us to know with any type of certainty about how the virus started. But it's my impression that there is a lot of circumstantial evidence that all the different agencies are trying to understand and analyze, and that's why they come out with the different bottom lines. But again, I think almost irrespective of whether or not we can be certain about it, we need to take the appropriate measures and encourage the Chinese and others to take these measures to prevent any future leak of these viruses from these research laboratories. That, I think, is the most important aspect of this.
On a macro level here, Director, I mean, the origins of the virus, China's attempts to cover it up, the spy balloon incident, reports that China wants to perhaps help the Russians in Ukraine. Now you have these primetime hearings that are being supported by both Republicans and Democrats en masse there in Washington regarding the threat that China poses to the United States. As we sit here right now this morning, how would you characterize the threat that China poses to the U.S.?
Oh, so it's multidimensional. You didn't even mention TikTok. There have been tremendous developments in China, particularly on the technological front, that I think pose a very serious security threat and risk to the United States as well as the rest of the world. It's clear that China is not in the mood to cooperate on a number of these issues and is being rather provocative in terms of whether it be intelligence collection activities or as well as refusing to cooperate on things as important as the pandemic. So I do think the world ahead is quite fraught. I'm glad that there is a bipartisan effort to try to look at what we can do to try to mitigate some of these threats. But I think the challenge is going to be a long-term one with China.
The theory that the COVID pandemic was caused by a leak from a Chinese government-controlled lab was largely dismissed by mainstream scientists at the start of the pandemic. Famously and influentially, this letter to The Lancet in February of 2020, signed by 24 scientists.
We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump argued the opposite.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
Many in America and beyond took their cue on what to believe based on what they thought of Donald Trump.
We know that it's been debunked that this virus was man-made or modified or anything like that, but
Skip forward 3 years and Donald Trump has left the White House, and there is less certainty in the natural origins theory. This week, the FBI director, for the first time publicly, gave the agency's official position.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
There are several factors that seem to point away from a naturally occurring virus. The structure of the virus is different in some key details from known viruses of a similar type. The differences can only be explained, according to some scientists, by so-called gain-of-function research. That is, intentionally manipulating a virus to make it more contagious with the hope of learning more of how to prevent pandemics. The next problem with the natural origin theory is that 3 years on, we still haven't found a similar enough virus in animals that would account for the spread to humans. With previous natural pandemics like SARS and MERS, intermediate animal hosts, bats and camels, were quickly discovered.
3 years ago today, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. There is still no consensus on the origins of the virus that has killed nearly 7 million people worldwide, including more than 1 million Americans. The question is back in the spotlight in Washington. The House yesterday unanimously approved a bill to declassify U.S. intelligence information on the origins of the coronavirus. The Senate passed it earlier, and the legislation now goes to President Biden's desk. It is not clear yet whether or not he will sign it. The president told reporters yesterday that he hasn't made that decision yet. A theory that the virus may have escaped from a lab in China has been a heated issue of this debate since early on in the pandemic. U.S. intelligence agencies are split on that. And joining us now to talk about this is Dr. Anthony Fauci. He served as President Biden's chief medical advisor and headed the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for decades, including under former President Trump. Dr. Fauci, good to see you as always. Thanks so much for being with us. President Biden, I guess you probably heard, said he hasn't decided whether he will sign this legislation. You were once his chief medical advisor. Would you advise him to do it?
Well, Jim, I don't want to be advising him when I'm not in that position right now. I'm sure he's going to make the right decision. One thing we can say, we'd like to learn as much as we possibly can about information that hopefully will be available. You know, there's this two sides. You know, one group says it more likely is one or the other. I must say that we all must keep an open mind, Jim, about this for sure, because nothing has been definitively proven. A fairly large group of very well-respected evolutionary virologists have examined epidemiological, virological, geospatial data from Wuhan and have come to the conclusion, not definitively by any means, but feeling that it is much more likely that it is a natural occurrence from an animal to a human.
And on this theory of a lab leak, I've been wondering this. Do we have any idea how that would even work? Have you heard any accounts as to how that might have happened? Is there speculation in the scientific community as to how that happened?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Jim. So one of the things that people maybe don't fully appreciate, that all of the intelligence agencies agree unanimously that this was not engineered. Namely, they didn't deliberately do this to make a bioweapon. Everybody agrees with that. No matter what your prior thoughts were, everybody agrees with that. A lab leak could be that someone was out in the wild, maybe looking for different types of viruses in bats, got infected, went into a lab, and was being studied in the lab, and then it came out of the lab. But if that's the definition of a lab leak, Jim, then that still is a natural occurrence. The other possibility is someone takes a virus from the environment that doesn't actually spread very well in humans and manipulates it a bit, and accidentally it escapes or accidentally infects someone, and then you get an outbreak. Those are the possibilities when you're talking about lab leak.
And as the researchers were getting sick, we saw some interesting things taking place in Wuhan, where they put in a new ventilation system and they just started to destroy their data. And this supposedly civilian entity, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, was taken over by the military. So we've seen a preponderance of evidence.
Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, from day one, from the earliest days of 2020, I've been saying, hey, we need to look at this very seriously. There's still circumstantial evidence only, but it heavily weighs in the direction of a research-related accident as the origin of COVID-19.
There are some, including Roger Marshall, who's a Republican senator from Kansas, that they're now talking about two leaks. Right. And the possibility that the first leak happened maybe in the month of September. They took care of that. They covered it up. Then the second leak came several months later. What do you think about that theory? How viable?
It's a viable hypothesis. Senator Marshall is a friend. We've been working together on this issue for more than 2 years. It's a viable hypothesis. It's still a hypothesis, even by his own account. But we need to look into that. We need to look into everything. And it's just outrageous that now more than 3 years, more than 3 years after the start of this pandemic, We don't have the kind of full investigation that we need. The biggest reason for that is that Chinese government has done everything in its power to block it. It's destroyed samples, hidden records, imprisoned Chinese citizen journalists for asking questions. It has a gag order preventing Chinese scientists from saying or writing anything, and it has blocked international efforts, and it's just outrageous. And our government also can be more transparent.
Gain-of-function research, it was happening, right? American taxpayer dollars went to support it. If they're not coming clean, and the CCP is not going to ever come clean, where are we?
Well, two questions. One is in terms of investigating, and as I said before, we need to keep looking. In terms of gain-of-function research, the United States government should not and shouldn't have been funding research in virology labs and other institutes where we don't have access, where there's not full transparency and accountability. So we certainly need to look at ourselves. In terms of gain-of-function research going forward, one, the term gain-of-function, it's a little bit fuzzy and different people have different definitions of it, but certainly we need very strong restrictions on gain-of-function on pathogens with pandemic potential. And that's a problem.
I would totally agree with you for the future, but now we're talking about trying to figure out what happened to
so but the two things are connected. If we want to say, well, we're imagining a safer future based on principles of transparency and accountability, there's no way we can build that future if we don't have transparency and accountability for what has happened to date. And that has to do with China, and it also has to do with ourselves.
I just wonder if we're ever going to get there.
The possibility that the COVID-19 virus leaked from a laboratory should not be ruled out. That's according to a former top Chinese government scientist who's been speaking to the BBC. George Gao was director of the Chinese Centre for Disease Control for much of the pandemic and has told a new BBC podcast that the question of the virus's origin remains open. Many scientists still believe that the virus is most likely to have passed naturally from animals to humans, but others argue that an accidental leak can't be ruled out. John Sudworth was our correspondent in China until he was forced to leave in 2021. He sent this report from New York.
Ever since the world got its first glimpse of the deadly disease circulating in Wuhan, China has dismissed the theory that COVID might have leaked from a lab known to have been experimenting with coronaviruses as a lie. But now, one of China's most senior scientists seems far less forthright when I ask him about that possibility.
I haven't seen anything. A lot of people have some suspicion, but I haven't seen anything.
But nor can you rule it out?
For science, you have to keep yourself open-minded. Keep yourself open-minded means everything is possible. Don't rule out anything.
Don't rule out anything, he says. But the lab leak theory was ruled out. Perhaps its association with this man helped cast it as a conspiracy theory.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
As did the claims from some Western scientists of overwhelming evidence that the virus, which started in bats, passed naturally to humans, perhaps via other animals in a market, a route by which deadly pandemics are known to have emerged in the past. It was that past precedent that influenced the World Health Organization mission to Wuhan, when it too effectively ruled out a lab leak, one of the scientists tells me in an interview for our podcast.
Everyone is biased. Yes, I'm biased for natural origin because of everything we've seen in the past. The sheer amount of consumption of wild animal meat is such a known high-risk situation.
All along, other scientists, while agreeing that COVID may well have come from animals in a market, say there's not yet enough evidence to definitively rule out the other possibility that it leaked from a lab. And with the change of presidency here in the US, that view, now somewhat freed from its political associations, has gained traction.